Hello and welcome to the Books Uncovered podcast, a brand new podcast from Fulcrum Publishing, where we explore the world of books and the people who make up the publishing industry. I am Sam Shinta, publisher of Fulcrum Publishing, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kateri Kramer, Fulcrum's marketing director. Hi, Kateri. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great, thank you. It's been a wonderful week here after the holiday. Last week, as you know, we got to celebrate the formal launch of our new Servant Leadership series at the Servant Leadership Conference here in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which was just wonderful because not only were we able to tell 400 attendees about the series, but in the process, we were able to let them know about our first book, which we'll be having that author on fairly soon, and also just to show people how Fulcrum aligns with a lot of those values that they were talking about. So it's just a great time.
Yeah.
How about you? What's new in your world?
No conferences, so to speak, but I am looking forward to getting some time in the mountains this weekend. I'm going to go camping and fly fishing with my sister and cousin. So getting out of the city heat and into the mountains, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Oh, fantastic! How are the rivers right now? Are they running low, or are they
They were running really, really
be?
high actually until about early last week to mid last week, and the flows have dropped pretty considerably, and we are in like prime fly fishing season right now. Like, you don't need waders, the water's warm, and it's starting to get to dry fly season, which is always fun. So
A friend of mine went fly fishing last week and caught a trout, and it was about a 12-inch trout,
nice.
Rainbow trout, beautiful. And he held it up in front of the camera. And Rick Kite, who is our the editor, or the series editor for the Servant Leadership series, posted on Facebook. He said, "Oh yeah, all the fish look that way when you hold them right up in front of the camera."
It is very true. When you extend your arms, they always look a little larger.
And of course, my friend then responded, "Well, next time I'm going to bring the G.I. Joe hands to hold the fish so that it looks even bigger."
Love it.
Well, I hope that you have good success up there in the mountains this week.
It should be nice, regardless of how many fish we catch.
Well, that's another one of our authors, Kenny Solway, always talked about the idea of fishing. He said, fishing is not about catching fish.
Nope.
It's the opportunity to catch fish.
Yes, exactly.
And so if you frame it properly, it works out really, really well.
Right. Yep.
Well, we have a terrific guest today. Our guest today is Jill Tietjen. Jill Tietjen is an author, internationally known speaker, and electrical engineer. After more than 45 years in the electrical utility industry, her professional focus is now on women's advocacy worldwide. A former blogger for the Huffington Post, she speaks nationally on the accomplishments of women, nominates women for awards, and continues to write books. In fact, she's done 12 to this date. Following the footsteps of her best-selling and award-winning books, Her Story, A Timeline of the Women Who Changed America, and Hollywood, Her Story, An Illustrated History of Women and the Movies. Her latest award-winning book, Over, Under, Around, and Through, How Hall of Famers Surmount Obstacles, was released by Fulcrum in May of 2022. She is a frequent keynote speaker, as her positive energy and her ability to relate to the audience result in inspired and energized listeners. And I'm sure that our listeners today will just capture a bit of Jill's wonderful energy. She has been inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame and the Colorado Authors Hall of Fame. Welcome, Jill Tietjen. How are you doing today?
Oh, thank you, Sam. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm doing really well.
Well, it is so wonderful to see you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Over, Under, Around, and Through, the new book that you just did about how Hall of Famers surmount challenges. What inspired you to do this book at this time, having written so many books?
It all started with a virtual happy hour early in the pandemic. I don't think many of us were familiar with virtual happy hours before, 2020, May of 2020. Not many of us were familiar with virtual happy hours before the pandemic. And so there I was, of course, in my office, drinking my wine at this virtual happy hour. And one of the other women on the virtual happy hour, whose name, fortunately or unfortunately, is also Jill, said, Jill, you should write a book. And it should be about how successful women overcame the obstacles in their lives. And I said to her, that's a really interesting thought. Why don't you and I have a discussion after the virtual happy hour and talk about what you're thinking about and why you think I should do that? And so, of course, we did. And then I called up my friend, or I think I emailed Ellie Greenberg, my friend. And I said, Ellie, what do you think of this idea? And she said, great. I mean, she was pretty lonely during the pandemic. It was really, really hard for her. And so I went over to her back porch where we were socially distant in June of 2020. And we started writing the book. And we said, we're going to interview women who are in the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame. They're not only in the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame, many are in the National Women's Hall of Fame. They're in international halls of fame all over the world. And we said, we'll interview as many as respond to our emails. And so we reached out to everyone that we knew that we thought we had a possibility of getting a hold of. And we ended up with 31 interviews. Well, 31 isn't a good number. 50 is a good number. And so we decided that we would also look into the historical women who are inductees and see if we could find stories for them, little hooks for them. And so there are 31 who were living at the time we did the interviews. 2 have since died, and 19 who were historical.
And so how familiar were you with the women in this book before you started working on it?
Some of them I didn't know at all. Some of them I knew very well.
Okay.
But some of them Ellie knew. Some of them neither of us knew. Some of them we knew very, very well. And so it was really a whole mix of women. And we told them that we had a different title to start with. And that's very common in publishing. And so when we approached them, we said, we're thinking about writing this book. Here are the questions we'd like to ask you. Of course, in the interviews, we never asked them those questions. We just started talking and off we went. And would you be willing to be interviewed by us? And 31 said yes.
So the book is built around the lessons from these women. So
Yes.
While it does capture their biographies, what I think you did a wonderful job of trying to identify the big lessons. What lesson or lessons did you take away from learning about these women and their spectacular lives?
Well, the first lesson, which is actually what's coming through loud and clear from the readers and readers' interest in this book, is that everyone faces obstacles in their lives. Absolutely everyone. And then what's happened since the book was, at least in draft form, even prior to when it was officially released or published, people love stories. And they love to hear stories about other people who have overcome the obstacles and how they overcame the obstacles. And I would say that's the biggest surprise, Sam and Kateri, is that we had no idea. When we started doing the interviews, because let's all of these interviews and then transcribing the interviews, it was so that Ellie and I could have a project to do together, and that so we would have something to do during the pandemic. And actually, one of the other things that I say, and it's really true now that people are mostly post-pandemic in their lives, most people are, the only way we were able to get 31 interviews is because these women were stuck at home. Because otherwise they are world travelers, they are doing all kinds of things with their lives. None of them ever understood, just like me. No one understands the concept of retirement. That's not who these women are. That's not what they do. And so the only way we were actually able to get them is they were home. And then Maria Guajardo, she's in Tokyo. And so now that we all knew Zoom, we could do a Zoom interview with her. And so we did the interviews, and then I did the transcripts. And one day Ellie and I were talking and we said, what are we going to do with all of this? And I said, I don't know yet, but I think it will happen. And as normally happens with me, I don't know about other people, where do these insights come from? Well, for me, they either come on the treadmill, usually, or in the shower. And that's how I get them. Sometimes ironing. I know nobody else but me in the whole world irons, but sometimes ironing. And so I think it was in the shower. And one day in the shower, my brain, or however it happens, said stories. We're going to do stories. And then at the same time, I was doing some research on the literature around resilience and grit and overcoming obstacles and those kinds of things. And so we were putting words together, the kinds of words or the kinds of skills that go with surmounting obstacles. And I remember sitting in Ellie's, by this time we were inside, it was a little cool to be outside. And we were sitting at her kitchen table and she said, well, we can only have 10 and we have 14. So we smushed them together so that we could have 10 because everything has to be 10. And so, it wasn't that any of it was planned. It was how it evolved.
But I love that idea that you took advantage of the circumstances, right? That as you said, without the pandemic, this book would have been very difficult to do. So you take advantage of the situation and you actually then build something that is framed around story. But the whole pandemic allows you to actually communicate and pull those stories in a way that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
And to that exact point, the first interview that we did was of Temple Grandin. And Temple Grandin, of course, is very famous and very well known, both as an animal scientist and as a person with autism, as an advocate for individuals with autism. And I had nominated Temple to the National Women's Hall of Fame, which she didn't know. And we started talking, and from the first interview, women, they were so authentic, they were so open, they were so giving, they were so warm, they were so honest. I don't think anybody had ever asked any of us before, what were the problems that you had along the way? How did you get through those problems? What did you do? Everybody, well, I'm in the book. So, and I'm an inductee, and nobody asks you that. They're always fawning over you because you're so wonderful. Well, we're not all so wonderful. And we all have problems, and we all have issues, and we all have obstacles. And the stories around them that we get to finally talk about them and talk about how and why. And the original concept that we had was that this was going to be puddles. These obstacles were going to be puddles in my life and how I kept my feet dry. And so we're talking to people about puddles, and someone says, oh no, it wasn't a puddle. It was a lake. and someone else said, oh no, it wasn't a puddle. It was more like an ocean. And so the way that they viewed the issue that they were faced with and the magnitude of that issue and what it took to get over it, as we say, actually in the book and in many of the talks that I give, these kinds of obstacles are life determining. They cause people to change the way they look at the world, the way they respond to the world. And so these are universal obstacles. These are universal issues. And the way the women dealt with them are the way that women and men deal with obstacles in their lives. This is not a women's book, although I know that some people view it that way. It's really for everyone.
I'm curious, because you've mentioned that the book might not have been possible had the access to individuals not been there. Did your actual process of writing change at all in the pandemic from before your previous 11 books? And then how did it change? And then have you adapted as you're writing a new book now, any of those different changes?
Well, this is the first book that is story driven. Mm-hmm. And as the two of you on this podcast know, we are now talking about additional story driven books that will follow. And so I've written stories, I've told stories, I've done stories, but not like this. And is it a result of the pandemic? I don't think it's a result of the pandemic. I think it's the result of this book. But this book wouldn't have been possible without the pandemic. So maybe it's not possible really to separate them. But one of the things that I thought about when Over, Under, Around, and Through got the award for women's literature nonfiction, which I think was last week from the Indie Book Awards, Next Generation Indie Book Awards. I've won awards before, or the books have won awards before, but they've almost always been not for the writing itself, either for the content or for the design or for some combination thereof. This award is actually for the writing, which is really fun and really cool and really interesting and really affirming. Because when I told Ellie that I had this idea in the shower, that we were going to write stories, she kind of went, oh, okay. And so I wrote the stories. And people like them. I mean, not only do people like them, it's winning awards for stories. So that means they're pretty good. So it's nice.
And I think it's cool because people they attach on to stories in a different way than information that they're given in some other form. And I think it's really telling about how good the storytelling actually is, that people are finding themselves or little bits of themselves in all 50 of those stories. And that's why the book is really special to them. Yeah, that's very cool.
Yes. And I just didn't know. You do. I mean, one of the women, Marilyn Vanderber Atler, who's in the book, Miss America 1958, incest survivor who wrote the foreword, she's one of my buddies, and we've been emailing back and forth. And I said, who knew, Marilyn? And she said, oh, Jill, you knew. No, no, I didn't. You put pen to paper, or in this case, of course, it's fingers to keyboard, and something happens. And, sometimes people really like it. Some people are saying this is a handbook for them. People are saying they're inspired by the stories. People are saying that it's helped them think about the problems that they're facing and overcome the obstacles in their lives. So that's also a wonderful response, to hear these people saying the book is wonderful. They find it inspiring. It's helping them.
Go ahead, Sam.
Well, I was just going to say, I think Kateri and Jill, you both hit on key points for that success. Just as a comment, Jill, the point that you're writing a book for all, not just for women, right? That yes, they're women's stories, but that doesn't mean that it's only for women. And then Kateri, that observation that anybody can read these stories and find themselves in these remarkable women, right? So sometimes we read these biographies of successful people and just think, oh my gosh, I could never be that person. But the idea that you have been able to write the stories in such a way that they become accessible to everybody so that they can see themselves or traits of themselves. And I think that's the key with how you did with the challenges, right? Because we all deal with challenges. And I think so many of us think, oh, well, famous people never have problems, right? But my goodness, they do. And they're just challenges, just like all of us have every single day. So I think that that's the key to why those stories are resonating.
Well, and I think also understanding, which people who are listening might not understand yet, what kind of obstacles we're talking about. We're talking about murder. We're talking about murder-suicide. We're talking about incest. We're talking about cancer. We're talking about prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination. We're talking about abusive environments. We're not talking about, I mean, and sometimes some of the obstacles seem a little bit smaller than that, but we're not talking about, someone who gets a broken fingernail. We are talking about huge, major, life-changing issues. And so when people see the stories and they understand that these are not broken fingernails, that it really helps them understand how these stories then can be relevant and relatable to them.
One thing that you haven't really said explicitly, but it's like come up a couple of times, is that it sounds like you have a very good sense of your like intuition and you're pretty in tune with it. How did you develop your like writerly intuition, and how might somebody else who's out there and has an idea for a book but is like second guessing everything, how do they kind of get to a different place where they trust it a bit more?
All right, well, let's talk about my intuition for a moment. So in 1995 was the first time I took something called the Emergenetics. It's a brain typing evaluation of personality. And out of my Leadership Denver class, I was the most left-brained. I'm an engineer. I'm trained as an engineer. Also, my Myers-Briggs test came back in about 1988, probably, as an ESTJ, so sensing instead of intuition. I got divorced in 1994. Lots of things happened in my life. And what a very important thing that happened was that my intuition, which had been repressed because of a lot of things, began to reemerge. I now actually test as an ENTJ, which is high in intuition. And so the rest of the answer to your question, I mean, there are a couple of pieces of the answer to your question. And one is, I didn't come out fully formed like this. I tell people now, I fell in love with writing in, I think it was 8th grade, when my English teacher showed us how to diagram sentences. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. And I don't know that anybody still diagrams sentences, but once I understood how adverbs related to verbs and how adjectives related to nouns and how you put a sentence together and what it meant, and then I had lots and lots and lots of practice. I wrote testimony for 35 years. I mean, there's a lot of practice. And I speak also. I was trained as a speaker. And actually, there's a huge relationship between being able to write conversationally, understanding that it's a reflection of how you speak. And so, but to the people who are saying, oh, I can't do this, and I want to write a book, but I can't start, the most important thing to do is to start writing. I don't care how good it is. I don't care how bad it is. I don't care how it is. Just start. You can edit it later. If you don't ever get it down on a piece of paper, then it's never, ever going to happen. And I already said, I had no idea these stories were good. I just wrote them. Apparently they're good. And so, but if I didn't write them down, then we'd never have an opportunity to know. So people who want to write a book, the first thing you have to do is you have to start.
I love that. One of the things that the question that comes up again and again in classrooms, in writers' conferences, it's, oh, how do you deal with that blank page? And the answer is, well, you deal with it by starting to write, right? And I think so many people, and I see this particularly with young people, think of writing as a linear process, that, oh, I have to start at the beginning and I have to end at the end. And no, you can start in the middle. You can start with the last part.
You don't even have to know where it is.
Exactly. Or you can write something that is not in the final book, right? But that it at least is getting something down on paper. So I think that's just such wonderful advice, to just start, right? And it seems so simple, and yet for so many people, I think it is a huge hurdle.
It's a huge hurdle. Oh, well, it might not be perfect. Well, I don't know that anything comes out the first time perfect. I have done that. I have written things. There is one recollection that I have. I was on an airplane from somewhere in Canada to Denver at 6:00 in the morning. And this was a work piece that I was writing, and on a piece of paper, not on a computer, on a piece of paper, 6:00 in the morning, I wrote it. I came back to my office, I looked at it, and I went, wow, I don't even think I changed a word. And sometimes, okay, so that's probably the only time that has ever happened. I mean, Ellie and I didn't know. We did not know.
So, we've talked about the challenge of writing. What is your favorite part of this process? I mean, you've done 12 books now. You're in the midst of not only promoting a new one, but also starting to think about some future projects. What is your favorite part of the process? What should authors look forward to and celebrate?
I was going to say my favorite part is the day that I signed the contract with the publisher. But of course, we're getting ready to do a new book where the book isn't written yet, and I'm going to sign the contract prior, which is like a miracle, before the book is written. Getting it, having it, seeing it, feeling it, opening it, reading it, knowing that I did it. I mean, that's just really, really cool. That the satisfaction of having it in your hands and going, all those hours of transcribing those interview tapes, which was not fun, just so you know. I mean, it's brutal work. It's absolutely brutal. And I'm always fast and get everything done. And no, transcripts are terrible. But having it in your hands and real, and then when people like this one, I mean, people like my other books, some of them, not all of them, most of them. But what people are saying about this book and how they react to it and how they feel about it. So the answer to your question is there isn't one thing. There's a lot of things. And I'm the kind of person, this was throughout my career. And now if I only have one thing to do, I am bored out of my mind. And so I need lots of things to do at the same time. So it's wonderful to me that I get to market over, under, around, and through, that I get to work on new books, that people like what I'm doing, what we're doing together.
Awesome. Well, as you know, and that was not only a hearty endorsement for the process, but for book culture generally, and why we love books. And one of the things that Kateri and I like to do with our guests is to talk about what you're reading or books that have made an impact on you. And so we'll like to always close with an idea of sharing some book ideas with people. And we've decided we're going to frame those in terms of questions. And so the question this this episode is, what is the last book you read that just took your breath away?
Yeah, well, you're not going to get that answer that you asked for. So that's just, I'm a trained expert witness, so I understand that I don't have to answer the question, because I actually have three of them, and they're all of the same kind of piece. And they are influencing my thinking. They are reinforcing my advocacy for women. They're reinforcing a lot of the things that I'm doing. The first one is called Invisible Women: Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez, which it's just amazing. Has anyone in Denver ever thought about why they plow all the main roads and not the residential streets? Well, she tells you why in here.
Wow.
Because nobody ever asked the women, how do you get to the bus? And then Cassandra Speaks by Elizabeth Lesser, which are the myths that demonize women in Western culture. And then The Chalice and the Blade
Classic.
by Ryan Eisler, which is an older book, which I only just found out about, which is, again, why are women not respected and honored in our culture today when actually they were for hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of years before kind of the start of what we call Western culture. And so that's what I'm up to right now.
Well, we'll take 3 for 1 anytime, Jill. What about you, Kateri? What's the last thing you read that truly just took your breath away?
Well, I'm going to give you a 2 for 1 since.
Oh, here we go.
But interestingly, kind of in the same genre, sort of, maybe a little bit of a stretch, but not really. So the first one is called The Invisible Kingdom: Reimagining Chronic Illness. That's by Megan O'Rourke. And that's a newer book, maybe last 3 or 4 months. She was the poetry editor at the New Yorker. And from the time that she exited college, started having some kind of bizarre, like full body symptoms. They weren't consistent. They'd show up occasionally and be pretty debilitating. And then it got worse. And it was just this really wonderful meshing of the like history of our medical system and the way it treats women, especially women with kind of nondescript symptoms, and then her own personal story. So that was like the kind of book that I had my highlighter out on every single page and already want to reread it. The second book is similar to that as well. It's called Bodywork: The Radical Power of Personal Narrative, and that's by Melissa Febos. And that is maybe the best craft book I've ever read about the power of the essay or memoir-esque work. But they're essays about that, which I really like because it has like this meta feel to it. And Melissa Febos just does this really, really great job of getting deep and getting uncomfortable with what she's doing in her writing and not kind of just skimming the surface with things. So anybody who likes to write or read that kind of work, that is like a must-have on your bookshelf.
Wonderful.
What about you, Sam?
Well, I'm a stickler for the rules, so I'm just going to give one. Although I was going through my reading list of recent books, and I could have come up with 20. So this means no disrespect to all the books I have loved over the past several years, but a book that really just changed how I read and just how I look at books is actually a novel. It's by Rachel Kushner. It's called The Flamethrowers. And I was familiar with her work as a nonfiction writer. I'd read some of her essays in the past, a whole bunch of which were collected last year in a book called The Hard Crowd. But The Flamethrowers was my first introduction to her fiction. She had actually written another couple of books before that, a couple of novellas, and then Telex from Cuba, and then a book after called The Mars Room. But The Flamethrowers is about, in no particular order, the art world in New York in the 1970s, Italian anarchists, and motorcycle racing, all centered around this heroine that's named Reno, who is a motorcycle racer, but kind of weaves through all these stories. And it just, I remember finishing the book and just feeling like the breath had just been taken out of me. I had never read something that alive in recent years that just brought me into all these worlds that I had not I'd known a little bit about, or in some cases a little bit more about, but just immersed me wholly into these worlds, and did it all centered around an atypical heroine, right? That this female motorcycle racer, right, who is living in these and running through these very masculine worlds. It just blew me away, and just opened me up to I immediately started looking at other authors like her. And so my bookshelves just blossomed with all these new authors. And I mean, what's better than that, right? When you discover a new author for yourself that other people know about, and then all of a sudden it just unlocks this whole world. So yeah, that would be the one.
That's awesome. I have officially 4 more books to add to my book.
Yeah, I know. This is the thing. This is the thing about, hey, what you're reading is we're gonna just have yawning bookshelves by the end of all of this. Well, Jill, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was wonderful talking with you and hearing not only about this book, but about your process as well. We congratulate you on the success of the book thus far, and know that there's a lot more to come on this one, and looking forward to working with you on a lot more in the future.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Okay, Kateri. Well, until the next one, and I understand you're not going to be here for the next one.
I'm not
so
going to be.
I will be joined by Kelly Jervey, our erstwhile producer, will actually be joining me as co-host on our next episode. So we're looking very forward to that. Yes. Well, say goodbye, everybody. And as I think, Kateri, would you say the last time? Happy reading?
Happy reading.
Okay. Thanks.